Speaking of bargains, here's what the weird bedfellows I mentioned at the top of the broadcast are singing from the same page about. They're pushing the International Monetary Fund to create $2 to $3 trillion in so-called special drawing rights, which is essentially a way of creating money during the pandemic by basically writing in a line item credit in a budget. That money can then be taken from the IMF and used by countries for lots of things, like lowering the global death toll, which could actually reach 40 million people if it continues to ravage weak countries. And what those countries could do is use that money to build up their healthcare systems, or just providing food and economic relief. An important point here: the special drawing rights are outright grants, not loans. So countries would not be adding to their debt burdens, and it would not cost the U.S. taxpayer a single dime. Now, put aside the moral imperative. The reason Goldman Sachs and other business leaders and corporations are behind this push is just pure economics. If you're a capitalist, which I'm not, you want the global economy to stop imploding, and you want it to recover. And the only way to do that is to provide a big flood of support to countries so people stay healthy and economic activity perks up, right? That's logic. The big block on this idea was the crazy ideologues in the White House. And because the U.S. has the biggest voice traditionally at the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the White House was blocking the creation of this badly needed credit line. Now, there are new twists in the story, which I thought important to discuss with Isaac Evans-Frantz, the director at Action Corp, and Don Wiviott, a farmer advocate based in Iowa. So, Don and Isaac, let's first set the stage, and I'm going to ask Isaac to explain a little bit about what an SDR is, a special drawing rights, and is it just simply the easy way to explain it, created money by the IMF?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good explanation. It's a virtual currency that the International Monetary Fund can create and has created in the past, as recently as 2009, that's specifically for situations like this when we face a financial crisis.
Mm-hmm. And when you say create a currency, I immediately think Bitcoin, but we want to make sure that our audience doesn't think that it's that speculative. As you point out, these things actually have happened before. And it's especially important to try to think about this now because, as was pointed out in a letter to a bunch of congressional leaders, and I'm going to refer to that in a second, we are experiencing more economic recessions than ever recorded since 1870. And the depth to which the global economy has collapsed affects obviously everybody throughout the globe and is suppressed not just economic activity, but is really endangering people's lives outside of the pandemic. Right, Isaac?
Yeah, that's true. And my organization, Action Corps, is concerned about the humanitarian impact of this financial crisis. What we know is that 90% of the deaths that are expected are not going to be directly from COVID, but from the impact on the healthcare system and the economic impact. So for instance, we expect the number of people who starve to death to be doubling this year. That's what the World Food Program has estimated. And those are preventable deaths. We know that with action from governments, if governments have the resources that they need, they can significantly reduce the amount of suffering and loss of life.
And obviously, to not to put too fine a point on it, but to be real clear, we are talking about coming to the aid of countries that were already being really hobbled by huge amounts of debt that have been accumulated over a number of decades, over sometimes generations. And so you add on the pandemic, the economic collapse in those countries, and you really see vast amounts of poverty and displacement and real crisis in many, many countries to the tune of tens of millions of people, right?
Correct. Yeah. And, we believe that we have a responsibility to our fellow human beings. And the beauty of these international resources from the IMF is that they have no cost to the US taxpayer. It's absolutely free. Not a penny would be cost to the US government. So these are free international resources, but right now the US Treasury is blocking the release of these resources to developing countries. And we want to make sure that people who are in need get the resources that aren't going to cost the US anything.
Of course, now when my audience hears the word free, I'm going to assume that some of people are going to roll their eyes. So just make clear, why is it free?
So this is an international financial resource that the International Monetary Fund can create out of thin air and allocate to all 189 member countries of members of the IMF. And each of those countries gets an allotment of these resources. And then countries that are really desperate for cash can trade those for a hard currency that's internationally strong, like the dollar or the yen or the euro. And it doesn't have any cost to any particular country.
So it's like a bookkeeping item, right? X country says we need X amount of money. The IMF says, okay, here's your drawing right. And then there's a line item that says this country now has this amount of this new currency, which it then can use in foreign markets, right? Is that?
I will just say that the US created trillions of dollars this past spring to help keep the US economy afloat. That didn't cost taxpayers anything. That was the government created money out of thin air. So what we're talking about is doing that on the global scale. Poor countries don't have access to internationally strong currencies. And so they're not able to have that sort of stimulus that the United States created for itself. So these international resources from the IMF, which don't have to be paid back, they're not loans to governments. I've been a skeptic of the IMF and have real critique of the IMF in the past, but this is something that would be a release to countries in proportion to the size, roughly proportion to the size of their economies. And for poor countries and middle-income countries, it would have a particularly important impact because those countries can't just create internationally strong resources. And the other, and it can also help, it can help stabilize economies and help countries be able to spend money on food, medicine, and other life-saving supports for the people.
Don, I was going to turn to you now with a question, but did you want to add to that?
Well, essentially, it's a credit. I mean, it's credit enhancement for an entire country. It's very similar to a consumer having $10,000 on their credit card, but they only need it in case of emergencies. And for these developing countries where their economies have shrunk because of COVID, it means that their ability to borrow money essentially has been diminished as their economy has been hurt and depressed. So what this does is that it shores it up if it's needed. It gives them the depth that if they need to print currency, that their currency will be accepted by other countries. It's a backstop.
And what I wanted to ask you, Don, is something that was referenced in the letter that I referenced just a moment ago, which was a letter that was sent to the leaders of the Congress by a whole raft of folks, the Progressive Caucus, the Congressional Black Caucus, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. And there's a sentence in here that goes directly to the area that you work in. I'm going to read it. SDRs and debt relief will not only prevent needless poverty, hunger, death, and disease abroad, but strengthen our economy at home, creating jobs by increasing demand for America's agricultural industry and U.S. exporters. And so tell us, Don, because you work in this space with farmers, what this would mean for the farmers that you know.
Sure. I mean, farming, food production, we are part of a global economy. And the farmers that I work with are actually smaller farmers. I mean, I work with sustainable farmers, farmers that are doing regenerative practices. And what we're doing is basically conserving soil and we feel producing a higher quality product. But the general health of the farm economy is really important to farmers and sustaining farmers. Because when you look to government assistance to farmers in the United States, say COVID, because of the fallout from COVID, most of that went to larger farmers. But smaller farmers are impacted by the economy extremely heavily. I mean, it's like any small business. So basically, we're part of the economy, and then also we grow exports. Here in Iowa, for instance, we export about 132 billion a year in goods, and out of the top 10 goods that we export, 8 of those are food related or agricultural related. So we're all part of that economy, even if we're feeding local people. And then a state like Iowa, I mean, 90% of the food we consume in Iowa comes from someplace else. It's not grown here. So it's important that we look at this as an integrated whole. So we not only benefit by exporting product, but we're part of the economy.
Yes, I don't have much sympathy, I have to say, for big agriculture, those dominating huge companies that are actually, as you well know, far better than I, driving small farmers out of business. But I do want to be clear and ask you again, do smaller farmers benefit from this too, obviously, because they have some export business as well, perhaps not on the scale of a Archer Midlands Daniel or Daniel Midlands, whatever what's the name of the company? ADM, right? But certainly smaller farmers have some business abroad that this would help them, right?
Some farmers directly. I mean, if they have specialty crops that are exported or they become part of packages of food, consumed organic food that gets shipped abroad, that happens too. But more importantly, the farm economy, if the overall pricing on farm commodities is sustained with international exports, that has a direct bearing on the pricing for small farmers as they sell their goods.
Now, one of the things that struck me when I first addressed this issue back in May with your colleague Mark Weisbrot was what a broad spectrum of folks supported this. You had Goldman Sachs, for example, supporting this idea of the SDRs, drawing rights, expanding them, all the way to the AFL-CIO. And it seems to me, to your point, Isaac, that the economy generally, and to your point, Don, as well, the economy generally can't resuscitate itself and recover unless you have broader prosperity and the ability of poor countries to recover and be able not only to consume, but to open up, say, garment factories that are now shut down. You've got millions of workers out of work in all sorts of industries. So there was broad support for this, and yet there was one roadblock, which seemed to be the White House. Am I right?
So the good thing is that this has actually passed the U.S. House of Representatives twice in the last few months. This summer, it was part of an appropriations package, and then this fall, as part of the Slim Down HEROES Act, it was included. The Congressional Budget Office has confirmed it has a $0 cost to the U.S. taxpayer at allowing these international financial resources to flow to countries around the world. And so right now we've been talking to senators and have gotten quite a bit of positive response. There is a bill, S 4139, which was introduced by Senators Durbin and Senator Sanders. But we've also been seeing that there are a number of Republicans. In fact, I've spoken personally with the chairman of the Senate Banking, Finance, and Foreign Relations Committees, those three committees chairman, who, and in those conversations, the conversations with other U.S. Senate offices, with, Republicans are generally supportive of this. It doesn't cost anything, and it would make a really big difference for the global economy. And there's widespread, support for international leadership, for there to be, most people, when I talk to them, do not want to see 10,000 children every month additionally starving to death this year, which is what's happening. This crisis, the COVID crisis, is resulting in an additional 10,000 children each month starving to death. And that's not acceptable to people across the aisle. And it's been awesome to see that bipartisan support growing for this. But
well, I'm
right.
not so sure that they actually care about children starving across the aisle, I have to say, since there's a record number of children in the United States who don't have enough food on a daily basis. And the reason is because Republicans are blocking an additional stimulus bill, which will give their parents money in their pockets. So I'm not as perhaps optimistic as you that there's this morality going on the other side. But to your point, there seems to be broad support, and there was just one blockage, which was the White House. And explain to me why you think that happened. Either you or Don, why do you think there was this one block going back a number of months that refused to let it go through.
Well, the concern that's been voiced by the Treasury Department is that these resources are untargeted, that these international financial resources would go to all 189 IMF member countries. And the stated concern is that, well, those would benefit, why would we need to send these resources to wealthy countries? But the fact is that for wealthy countries, it's just an accounting entry. Wealthy countries don't need these reserves. They have their own reserves that are very strong. And who they'll really benefit are people in poor countries and middle income countries. So it's a very weak argument, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But that's the concern, is that these resources are untargeted, and apparently the Treasury Department would prefer to decide who gets to live and who gets to die.
Do you want to jump in on this, Don?
Well, I mean, back to the fact that this is a very big tent that we're under. I mean, I work with all kinds of farmers. I mean, farmers are Republicans and Democrats, and I'm on the board of the Farmers Union, but also board members of the Iowa Corn Growers Association, not known for rabid liberalism, very conservative people. I mean, they don't want to see people die either. So I do think that the politics are extraordinary sometimes once you get to the executive, but for the people that count and the folks that elect these senators, and I think they're going to listen to their constituents, there's no downside to them supporting this.
Last question to either of you, can Joe Biden make this happen by executive order without congressional action, or would he have to wait until Congress passes the bill to actually make this happen?
So the Treasury Department can authorize up to a certain amount of these international financial resources to be released by the IMF. The US has veto power at the IMF, so currently has blocked this. But in order for an allocation of these international financial resources at the size and speed that's needed, Congress would have to vote for that. And as I mentioned, it's passed the House, so it's now just about mobilizing the Senate and making sure that we have the senators, the Republican senators who are supportive of this. We need them to speak up, and we need them to find their courage and their moral courage and their leadership and weigh in with the Treasury for this and ultimately pass legislation. We'd like to see that happen this year. We think it's possible. There are multiple vehicles. There's growing support for this. It can make a really big difference when constituents of senators reach out and let them know this is something they want. And you can find information at globalcovidresponse.org. At globalcovidresponse.org, there's a Take Action tab, and there's a template for writing to your senator, sending a quick email, which can make a difference. We've already heard from some of the Senate offices that they're hearing from constituents, and that's made them pay attention to this issue.
Well, my audience will get right on that task. We are definitely a group of many activists who know how to write letters, know how to make phone calls. And Don and Isaac, I really appreciate you coming on the show and really informing my audience about this really important topic. And we're going to keep track of this. And hopefully it'll pass and you won't need us anymore, and we'll just be able to celebrate. But if there's any blockade, we'd love you to come back and update us so we can get our audience activated again and help with the push. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks for your time.